Come set your rule and reign in our hearts again. Increase in us, we pray.
Hey Trinity Grace, welcome back to New Community. This is indeed Albert here. I know what's going on my face. Some of you are like, who is that? It's still me. The best question I've gotten in the past few weeks since I shaved and created this mustache was, please tell me that is for Movember. And it is indeed for Movember. It was just very natural for me this year to want to join the cause, just remembering Linda's dad and his fight with prostate cancer, and just even as I have my own battle with depression, and so it's been a delight to join this cause to raise awareness for men's health. So that's why this is going on, but yeah, you probably won't see it this Sunday because it's going to all come off, and I will look like a teenager again with a clean-shaven face. So all joking aside, we are in the Beatitudes. We're finishing off the second half of the Beatitudes this week. I want to first say thank you to Matt Wilkes. He did a wonderful job expositing the Beatitudes, or that's just another way to say unpacking the Bible and explaining what it means. I got to listen to his second message online and was blessed personally. As we get into the Beatitudes, and as a way of introduction, there's a reason why I am sitting at the foot of my staircase right now. I'm going to try to be a little bit creative today just to illustrate what's going on a little bit in the Beatitudes. And so I want to start off by reading chapter 5, verse 1 here. And Matthew writes, "Seeing the crowds, he, Jesus, went up on the mountain. And when he sat down, his disciples came to him." And so before Jesus preaches his manifesto, his Sermon on the Mount, and he breaks out into the Beatitudes, you need to understand that just as I am at the foot of my staircase, Jesus was at the foot of a mountain, and he saw large crowds coming towards him because he had garnered fame from all the healings and his authoritative teaching. And so Jesus does something very peculiar. He weeds out the crowd. How does he do this? He begins to walk up the mountain. Naturally, if the great crowds see Jesus walking up the mountain, it's going to filter some people out, because walking up a mountain is difficult. We don't know how high he went, but we get the sense from Matthew's short description that not everyone followed him. So I'm going to walk up the staircase as an illustration, as a symbol of walking up a mountain. So join me. Now, certainly walking up this short flight of stairs is not difficult. But think of Jesus walking up this mountain, and literally, physically, it filtered some people out. Now, there's a lot of profound symbolism going on here. There's meaning to Jesus doing this. From being up the mountain and being closer to the heavens as you're up the mountain, there's a wonderful symbolism in that Jesus is drawing people closer to the heavens, and through his presence and through his teaching. The fact that it's Jesus himself that drew the disciples to follow him. We could just easily misconstrue this climbing up the mountain to mean that we as Christ followers must work, that it's our effort, our willpower. But we must not forget that the reason why the disciples, aka the committed, the ones who wanted to follow Jesus, they were willing to follow him up the mountain because they were following him. They had fallen in love with him because of his great love and compassion and tenderness and his truth and his teaching and every blessing and everything that he embodied that they had experienced of him. And so that's a wonderful symbol of God's grace causing us to grow up. God's grace causing us to continue to move towards holiness. God's grace causing us to wrestle with our salvation and to continue to make effort, even as Paul the Apostle says in other places, that he worked harder than all the other apostles, but it wasn't him. It was the grace of God, but God's grace was not without effect. And so we see the disciples, the committed ones, following Jesus up the mountain, and then Jesus sits down as a rabbi does, and the disciples sat at his feet, as disciples do. And so here now Jesus opens his mouth, and Matt explained the Beatitudes very well, that it was a manifesto of Jesus, and the common thread through all the Beatitudes is that Jesus is defining blessedness. He is defining the blessed state, the blessed being, aka, I loved Matt's definition, the flourishing life, that Jesus was unpacking what the flourishing life looks like for the Christ follower. And so here are characteristics of a Christ follower. Not that we muscle these characteristics or try to fabricate these characteristics. Jesus is not intentionally telling us to go about mourning, for example, and producing tears and emotionally manipulating ourselves like actors so that we are constantly sad and walking around like Eeyores. No. What Jesus is saying here is, as we continue to be honest about the hardship of life, as we are honest before God and his greatness, his holiness, and we come to terms with our need for him, our brokenness before him, our need for forgiveness and compassion and mercy from God, that we realize that we are embodying these characteristics. And as we embody these things, like being poor in spirit, realizing that we are mourning in heart because we're sinners and we need help, when we realize that we don't want to be the muscled and powered people in the world, but rather pursuing a certain meekness. When we realize that we are hungry and thirsting for something in life, but it's righteousness that we are seeking. As we find ourselves naturally, that God reveals these conditions in our hearts, then Jesus is so delighted to come in those moments and to be our answer, to be our joy, to be our satisfaction. And so we become blessed. We find ourselves flourishing and living life as God truly meant it to be in his Son, and so counterculturally from the world. So I want to just lend one more perspective to these Beatitudes, and then I want to suggest some framework or just something to have in the back of your mind as you go through the study today. So first, one more perspective. I think it's so neat that right after the Beatitudes, Jesus quotes these now immortalized analogies for his people. And he says, "You are the salt of the earth, and you are the light of the world." How are we going to be salty? How are we going to add flavor to the world, a goodness to the world, and a preserving quality to the world? And how will we be bright to the world? It's through these Beatitudes. As we live into these Beatitudes and as we look into the face of Jesus himself, who embodies these Beatitudes to perfection, and we have his life overflowing in and through us, that we become salty, we become bright. So I want to invite you to begin today's session first by observing the world around you. Observe how your friends, your co-workers, how our society and culture in general, how do they pursue happiness? How do they define happiness? Okay, so spend some time observing that, and then in the back of your mind, throughout today's study, as you go deeper into the Beatitudes, I want you to ask, and even make it a prayer, God, help me to honestly see how I define happiness. Because perhaps as you are studying the Beatitudes, it can become an opportunity for you to return to God, to just have an honest reckoning with God in your heart, even in a moment tonight. In your heart, say, God, I realize that I have been pursuing happiness not according to your definition. I've been trying to self-flourish my life in ways that are contrary to what you envision for your people. So have that going on in the back of your mind. And then I hope that in your study that you guys can come together and really help each other process the meaning of these Beatitudes and the implications of them, and to apply them, to help each other apply them together in your lives. Well, have a great study. God bless, and we'll see you soon enough. Bye.
Build your kingdom.